Let's celebrate President's Day by Barbara D. Robertis, illustrated by Thomas Sperling. We celebrate President's Day every February by honoring our nation's presidents. Two of our greatest American presidents were born in February. Jorj Washington was born on February 22nd. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12th. President's Day always falls between these two important birthdays, on the third Monday of the month. Jorj Washington, born on February 22nd, 1732. Abraham Abe Lincoln, born on February 12th, 1809. Jorj Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732, in the British colony of Virginia. At that time, there was no country called the United States of America. There were 12 American colonies that belonged to Great Britain. One more colony was added after Jorj was born, making a total of 13. The 13 original colonies, claimed by both New York and New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Young Jorj and his father at Ferry Farm. Jorj's family moved to Ferry Farm when he was 6 years old. There, he loved to ride horseback over the hills and fields. Jorj went to school as often as he could, but he usually did lessons at home, as most children did at that time. He liked math best. He also learned from adults around him. Jorj liked to learn by watching and listening. When Jorj was 11 years old, his father died. After this, he spent much of his time with his brother Lawrence, who was 14 years older than Jorj. Lawrence lived on a farm he had named Mount Vernon. Lawrence helped Jorj improve his mind and his manners. He was a hero to Jorj. With Lawrence's help, Jorj learned to be a surveyor. At age 16, he was given his first job, exploring and mapping the Virginia frontier. When Jorj was 20, Lawrence died. This was a sad time for Jorj. He decided to leave Mount Vernon. Eager for adventure, Jorj joined Virginia's army. By the time he left the army 6 years later, he had become commander of the troops. At age 26, Jorj married Martha Custis, a young widow with 2 children. Martha was very wealthy. For her wedding, she wore a yellow silk dress, purple satin shoes, and pearls in her hair. Jorj was handsome in his blue jacket lined with red silk. Washington returned to Mount Vernon with his new family. He read all the latest books on farming. Jorj liked trying new ideas. The Washingtons spent 16 peaceful years at Mount Vernon. But trouble was on its way. People in the American colonies did not think they were being treated fairly by the British. A meeting was called to discuss the problem. Washington watched and listened. When he arrived at the second meeting, Washington was wearing his old army uniform. Everyone knew what that meant. Washington thought the time had come to fight for freedom from the British. Washington crossing the Delaware, painted by Emanuel Lutz. Washington was asked to lead the American army. He accepted the job, but he refused to accept any pay. On July 4th, 1776, the United States of America adopted its Declaration of Independence and claimed freedom from Great Britain. The Revolutionary War followed. For a while, it looked as if the British would win. But General Washington was clever and determined. A British general called him the Old Fox. Once, Washington organized a surprise attack on Christmas night. He led his soldiers across the Delaware River in dark, cold weather and won an important victory. The war lasted for 8 years. In 1784, The United States and Great Britain made peace. At last, the American people had won freedom for their country. After the war, Washington left the army and returned to Mount Vernon. For 5 years, he was happy just to be a farmer. Then, once again, Washington was asked to help his country. The United States of America needed a president. Everyone thought Washington would do a good job. Although he was content at Mount Vernon, Washington answered the call to serve his country. Jorj Washington is sworn in as the first President of the United States. Jorj Washington was elected as our first president in 1789. There were many problems facing the new country. President Washington tried to do what was right, even when it was not easy. He worked hard to make the country strong. Washington enjoyed planning a new capital city. He chose a site on the Potomac River, across from Mount Vernon. The city was later named Washington in his honor. After his second term as president, Washington returned home to Mount Vernon for the last time. 2 years later, on December 14, 1799, he died. Henry Lee, a longtime friend of Jorj Washington, spoke at the memorial service. 14 words of Lee's tribute to Washington have become famous. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Above, a statue of Jorj Washington in Westerly, Rhode Island. Opposite, the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. In another tribute, the minister Richard Allen recalled Washington's advice: to love your country, to obey its laws, to seek its peace. Many years later, in 1885, the towering Washington Monument was dedicated to the memory of our first president. We remember Jorj Washington on President's Day. He worked to make our country free and strong. For this, we celebrate him. The United States of America in 1809, the year Abraham Lincoln was born. 10 years after Jorj Washington died, Abraham Lincoln was born. The United States of America was facing new problems. These problems were growing more and more serious. Another clear-thinking and courageous leader would be needed. Fortunately, Abraham Lincoln would be ready for the challenge. Young Abe Lincoln cutting wood for his mother. Abraham Lincoln was born in the state of Kentucky on February 12, 1809. Abe and his family lived in a small cabin with one window and a dirt floor. Even as children, Abe and his older sister, Sarah, worked hard helping their parents. Abe's father taught him to chop wood as soon as he could lift the heavy axe. Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial, Indiana. This is a replica of Abe's Indiana childhood home. The Lincoln family moved to Indiana when Abe was 7. 2 years later, his mother died. It was a sad time. The next year, Abe's father married a widow with 3 children. Abe's stepmother gave her new children, Abe and Sarah, as much love as her own. She made a cozy, cheerful home for everyone. Years later, Abe spoke of her as his angel mother. Abe was happy when he was able to go to school. Because all the children said their lessons aloud at the same time, it was called the Blab School. But Abe was not able to attend school often. In farm areas, teachers had to travel around to many different schools. Sometimes school would last for just a few weeks. However, Abe learned in other ways. He loved reading. As Abe grew up, he used every spare minute to read. He would walk many miles just to borrow a book. One of his favorite books was about Jorj Washington. Above, Abe Lincoln as a boy, reading by firelight in his family's cabin. Abe continued to help his parents as much as he could. He also worked for other settlers, clearing fields and splitting logs for fences. Abe enjoyed going to the general store in town. He could read newspapers there and listen to people talk. Abe was good at telling jokes and stories. The shopkeeper gave him a job because people liked him. One day, the shopkeeper asked young Lincoln to take some goods down the river to New Orleans. There he saw people being sold as slaves. He thought this was terribly wrong. He never forgot what he saw. When Lincoln returned home, he had to quit his job and help his family move to Illinois. He soon found a new job at a store there. At the store, Lincoln made a lucky discovery. He found a law book stored in an old barrel. Lincoln had always wanted to study law. He dusted off the book and began to read. After studying many books, Lincoln passed the law exam. Now he could be a lawyer. Meanwhile, friends had asked Lincoln to run in a state election. The first time he ran, he did not get enough votes. He lost. But the second time he ran, he won. When he was 30, Lincoln fell in love with Mary Todd. 2 years later, they were married. The Lincolns had 4 sons, named Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. Lincoln and his son Thomas, Tad. Abraham Lincoln, Congressman-elect from Illinois. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to Congress. There he spoke out against slavery. He believed that no one had the right to make another person a slave. Next, Lincoln ran in an election for the Senate. His many speeches about slavery made him famous. Lincoln lost the election, but he was not ready to give up. He would run for president. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as the 16th President of the United States. But there was no time for celebrating. The arguments about slavery were tearing the country apart. A group of southern states withdrew from the United States. They formed a separate country called the Confederate States of America. Soon, the North and the South were at war with each other. Gettysburg National Military Park, site of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Lincoln wanted to keep the United States together. He was willing to see a war fought if it would keep his country from breaking apart. Finally, after 4 years, the Civil War ended. The North and the South were back together as one country. The United States of America was united again. Now Lincoln could end slavery. He knew he had the support of many Americans. But he also knew there were people who hated him enough to kill him. 5 days after the war's end, President and Mrs. Lincoln went to a theater. During the play, a man sneaked up behind Lincoln and shot him. The president died the next day, on April 5, 1865. Later that same year, a law was passed that ended slavery in the United States. For the first time, all people of our country were free. Lincoln's dream had finally come true. Emancipation. Lincoln's dream to end slavery came to pass on December 6, 1865, with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Statue of Abraham Lincoln inside the Lincoln Memorial. In 1922, the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. Inside this beautiful building rests a famous statue of Abraham Lincoln. Chiseled in one wall of the memorial is Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. In this speech, he spoke of his hope that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. We remember Abraham Lincoln on President's Day. He worked to make all people in our country free. For this, we celebrate him. Sunrise behind the Washington Monument, as seen from inside the Lincoln Memorial. The Mount Rushmore National Memorial in South Dakota bears the faces of 4 U.S. presidents: Jorj Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. When we celebrate President's Day every February, we remember all the presidents who have served our country. We remember the times they tried to do what was right, even when it was not easy. The White House in Washington, D.C. has been the official home of the President of the United States since the year 1800. We remember all our presidents on President's Day. They worked to protect our country and our freedoms. For this, we celebrate them. Voting for a new president every 4 years is a big responsibility. We are grateful to our voters for trying to choose good presidents. We honor America's voters on President's Day. They try to choose good leaders. And by voting, they help to protect our country's freedom. For this, we thank them.